Hello everyone. Today, Biker Justice Analyst bring you a story full of humanity and compassion. Enjoy listening.
Hell's Angel sees his blind childhood teacher abandoned at the bus stop. The truth left him stunned. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across Main Street as Hank Mulligan's weathered pickup truck rumbled through his old hometown. His calloused hands gripped the steering wheel, knuckles decorated with faded tattoos that reminded him of a life he'd left behind. Every building seemed to hold a memory. Some good, most not so much. "Man, this place hasn't changed a bit," he muttered, passing by Wilson's Hardware where he'd once smashed windows as a teenage troublemaker. The owner had pressed charges back then, and rightfully so. Hank winced at the memory. The truck's engine hummed as he cruised past his old high school, its red brick walls still standing proud despite the years. That's when he saw her, a slender figure standing at the bus stop, her silver hair catching the sunlight. Even from a distance, he recognized her immediately. Ms. Nora Williams. Hank's foot eased off the gas pedal. She stood tall, one hand gripping a white cane, the other clutching her purse close to her body. At first glance, she looked composed, just as he remembered her from his school days. But something wasn't right. He pulled over to the curb, about 30 feet away, and watched through his side mirror. Ms. Williams shifted her weight from one foot to the other, her head tilting slightly as if listening intently to her surroundings. A bus approached, and Hank expected it to stop, but it drove right past her. Ms. Williams' shoulders slumped ever so slightly. "That ain't right," Hank growled, his protective instincts kicking in. He watched as she reached out, trying to get the attention of a passing teenager who simply walked around her, headphones firmly in place. The sight made his stomach turn. This was Ms. Williams, the same teacher who'd stayed after school to help. Him with his reading when everyone else had given up on him. The woman who'd never sent him to the principal's office, even when he probably deserved it. Hank turned off his engine and sat there, wrestling with his conscience. She wouldn't remember him, he thought. Or worse, maybe she would. Remember the troublemaker who'd made her life difficult all those years ago. But as he watched her standing there, increasingly uncertain, he couldn't stay in his truck any longer. With a deep breath, he opened his door and approached her, his heavy boots scuffing against the sidewalk to announce his presence. "Ms. Williams?" His gruff voice softened as he spoke. "Can I help you with anything?" She turned toward his voice, her unseeing eyes somehow still carrying the same warmth he remembered. "Oh, thank you. Yes, I could use some assistance. The buses seem to be running late today." "Where are you headed?" Hank asked, noting how her fingers tightened around her purse strap. "The community center," she replied, managing a small smile. "There's a social gathering today. I try to attend when I can." Hank's chest tightened. The community center was clear across town, and by the looks of it, the buses weren't stopping. How long had she been standing here? "I'd be happy to give you a ride, ma'am. I'm headed that direction myself." He wasn't, but that didn't matter now. "Oh, I wouldn't want to impose." She hesitated, but relief flickered across her face. "No imposition at all. I'm an old student of yours, actually, Hank Mulligan." Her face brightened with recognition. "Hank? Little Hank Mulligan? Well, I suppose you're not so little anymore. Before you continue listening, please let me know where in the world are you watching from today. Now back to the story." Hank stood at the bus stop, watching the city bus rumble away with Ms. Williams safely aboard. His weathered hands were still warm from where he'd helped guide her up the steps. The sight of her white cane tapping uncertainly against the metal stairs played over and over in his mind. "Can't believe nobody else even tried to help," he muttered, shaking his head. His gaze swept across the busy sidewalk where people hurried past, heads down, absorbed in their own worlds. The same sidewalk where Ms. Williams had stood alone just minutes ago. Something didn't sit right with him. The Ms. Williams he remembered had always been surrounded by people, students seeking her advice, fellow teachers sharing lunch with her, parents thanking her after school. Now she seemed so isolated. Hank walked to his pickup truck and climbed in, the old seat creaking under his weight. He sat there for a moment, drumming his fingers on the steering wheel. The community center wasn't far. He could easily follow the bus route. Before he could talk himself out of it, he turned the key and pulled into traffic. 20 minutes later, he parked across from the community center. The brick building looked cheerful enough with its colorful banners advertising a local art show. He watched as Ms. Williams made her way carefully up the front steps, her cane sweeping back and forth. Inside, Hank hung back, pretending to study the artwork while keeping an eye on his former teacher. She moved through the room with practiced ease, but something about her manner seemed different from the confident woman he remembered. Her shoulders were slightly hunched, as if trying to make herself smaller. What really caught his attention were the reactions of others around her. He recognized several faces from his school days, former classmates who were now respected members of the community. When Ms. Williams approached them, their greetings were polite but brief. They quickly found reasons to move away, leaving her standing alone again. "Hey, Sarah," he heard Ms. Williams say warmly to a woman he recognized as the former class president. "How are your children doing?" "Oh, they're fine," Sarah replied, her voice tight. "Excuse me, I need to check on the refreshments." She hurried away, leaving Ms. Williams with her hand still slightly raised in greeting. Hank's jaw clenched. He remembered how Sarah used to spend hours after school getting extra help from Ms. Williams. Now she couldn't spare 2 minutes for conversation? The more he watched, the more his concern grew. Something had happened in this town. Something that had turned people against the kindest teacher he'd ever known. By the time he left the community center, his mind was made up. The next morning, Hank pulled up outside the address he'd gotten from the phone directory. The apartment building was on the outskirts of town, its faded brick exterior and cracked sidewalk speaking of better days long past. This was no place for someone like Ms. Williams. He climbed the narrow stairs to the second floor, his heavy boots echoing in the stairwell. The hallway smelled of old carpet and yesterday's cooking. Apartment 2B was at the end, its brass numbers hanging slightly crooked. Hank stood before the door, his hand raised to knock. The tough ex-biker who'd faced down rival gangs without flinching now felt uncertainty creeping in. Was he overstepping? Maybe she wouldn't want to see him. Maybe there was a good reason everyone was keeping their distance, but the image of her standing alone at that bus stop wouldn't leave him. Taking a deep breath, he rapped his knuckles against the door. Ms. Williams opened her door slowly, her hand resting on the familiar wooden frame. "Who's there?" she asked, her voice carrying a hint of caution. "It's Hank Mulligan, Ms. Williams. From yesterday? I wanted to check how you're doing." Recognition brightened her face. "Hank. Oh my, please come in." She stepped back, gesturing with practiced ease. "Watch the small step there." Hank entered the modest apartment, taking in the neat but worn furniture. Everything had its place. Books lined the shelves in careful order, and the cushions sat perfectly, straight on the faded blue couch. The morning light filtered through thin curtains, casting a soft glow on family photos that looked like they hadn't been updated in years. "Would you like some tea?" Ms. Williams offered, already making her way to the kitchen with confident steps. "Please don't trouble yourself," Hank said quickly. "I can make it if you'd like." "Nonsense," she replied, her fingers finding the kettle with practiced ease. "I've been making tea in this kitchen for 20 years. Being blind doesn't change that." They settled in her small living room moments later, the tea steaming between them. Ms. Williams sat in a well-worn armchair, her hands wrapped around her cup. "How are you really doing, Ms. Williams?" Hank asked gently. "Yesterday at the bus stop, things seemed difficult." She was quiet for a moment, her fingers tracing the rim of her teacup. "Life has its challenges, Hank, but I manage." "The community event yesterday, I noticed people weren't exactly welcoming." Ms. Williams's smile faltered slightly. "Things changed after Tom passed away. He was my husband," she added softly. "The community, well, they had their own lives to live. My family." She paused, taking a careful sip of tea. "They moved away years ago. Called less and less. You know how it goes." Hank's chest tightened. "And you're managing on your own?" "I have my pension," she said, straightening her shoulders. "It's not much, but I make do. The blindness makes things tricky sometimes, especially with getting around town, but I've learned to adapt." "But surely there are services, people who could help." "The waiting lists are long," she interrupted, her voice maintaining its cheerful tone despite the weight of her words. "And pride. Well, pride is a funny thing, Hank. Sometimes it's all we have left." Hank leaned forward, his tea forgotten. "Ms. Williams, I could help. I own a mechanic shop now, doing well for myself. I could arrange transportation, maybe help, with groceries." "That's very kind of you," she said, her smile gentle but firm. "But I'm fine, really. I've managed this long." She set her cup down carefully on the side table. "Besides, you have your own life to lead. You can't be worried about your old teacher." "But, thank you for stopping by, Hank," she said, rising from her chair. "It's been wonderful catching up with you." Hank stood, recognizing the polite dismissal. His eyes caught sight of past due notices partially hidden under a book on the side table. But Ms. Williams maintained her dignified pose, her smile never wavering. "At least let me give you my number," he said, "in case you need anything." "That's very thoughtful," she replied, but made no move to write it down or record it. "Thank you for your concern, Hank. It means a lot to know people still care." The memory of Ms. Williams' small, tidy apartment haunted Hank for days. Her brave smile and gentle insistence that everything was fine didn't match the worn furniture and empty rooms he'd seen. Every time he closed his eyes, he pictured her sitting alone in that quiet space, and his heart ached. At his auto shop, Hank found himself distracted, his mind wandering back to their conversation. While working on a transmission, he dropped a wrench 3 times before finally setting his tools down with a frustrated sigh. Something about this whole situation just didn't add up. "Hey, Pete," he called out to his elderly regular customer who was waiting for an oil change. "You've been around here forever. What do you know about Ms. Williams?" Pete looked up from his newspaper. "Nora Williams? The teacher?" He scratched his chin thoughtfully. "Sad story, that one. Used to be the heart of the community, she did. Always had time for troubled kids like you were, Hank." Hank wiped his hands on a shop rag and leaned against a workbench. "What happened to her?" "Well, she married Danny Roberts back in '95. Remember him? Rode with the Steel Knights, motorcycle club." The name hit Hank like a punch to the gut. Danny Roberts had been a legend in the local biker community. "Danny was her husband?" Pete nodded slowly. "They were happy too, despite what folks said about him being rough around the edges. She saw the good in him, just like she saw it in you." Hank's throat tightened. He remembered Danny now, a tall man with kind eyes who'd sometimes stop by the school to bring Ms. Williams lunch. The pieces started falling into place. Throughout the day, Hank kept asking questions. The hardware store owner told him about how Ms. Williams used to organize community events. The librarian remembered her reading programs for underprivileged kids. But everything changed after Danny's accident. It was a rainy night, Mrs. Cooper at the diner explained, her voice dropping to a whisper. Danny was heading home from a club meeting. Truck driver fell asleep at the wheel. After that, she shook her head. Nora just withdrew. As the day wore on, more details emerged. How Ms. Williams had slowly lost her sight over the years following Danny's death. How the community, unsure how to help, and perhaps reminded of their own prejudices against bikers, had gradually pulled away. The woman who had once been everyone's favorite teacher became a ghost in her own town. Sitting in his truck that evening, Hank stared at the setting sun. He thought about the vibrant woman who had once stayed after school to help him with his reading, who had believed in him when nobody else did. He remembered her infectious laugh echoing down the school hallways, the way she'd decorated her classroom with student artwork, how she'd made everyone feel special. Now she sat alone in that small apartment, her world shrunk to the size of her 4 walls, while the very community she had helped build carried on without her. The contrast was stark and painful. The woman who had given so much of herself to others now had no one to lean on when she needed it most. Hank gripped his steering wheel tighter, his knuckles turning white. The cruel irony wasn't lost on him. How Ms. Williams had married a biker, the very kind of person most people in town looked down on, and how that connection had somehow contributed to her isolation after Danny's death. It seemed the prejudices that she had fought against all her life had finally caught up with her, leaving her to face her darkest days alone. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across Hank's workshop as he wiped grease from his hands, his mind drifting back to his younger days. The memory of leather jackets, thundering motorcycles, and late-night rides flooded his thoughts. But something else nagged at him too, a face from the past, connected to Ms. Williams in ways he was only beginning to understand. Tommy Williams, Hank muttered to himself, remembering the man who had once been a mentor to him in the gang. Tommy had been different from the others, educated, well-spoken, and married, to a teacher. Now, it all made sense. That teacher had been Ms. Williams. Hank climbed into his truck and drove to the outskirts of town, where a small memorial garden stood dedicated to fallen bikers. The place was quiet, except for the rustling of leaves and the distant hum of traffic. Stone markers dotted the peaceful space, each one telling a story of a life lived fast and often ended too soon. As he walked among the markers, his boots crunching on the gravel path, a familiar voice called out, "Well, well, if it ain't Hank Mulligan." Jake Peterson stood there, still wearing his leather vest despite the warm weather. His gray beard was longer than Hank remembered, and his eyes carried the weight of too many hard years. "Jake," Hank nodded, extending his hand. "Didn't expect to see you here." "I come by sometimes," Jake shrugged, taking Hank's hand in a firm grip. "Remember the old days, the good and the bad." They walked together in silence until they reached Tommy's marker. The stone was simple, bearing only his name and the years of his life. "You know," Jake said, scratching his beard, "Tommy was different, not like the rest of us wild ones. He had something special going with that teacher wife of his." Hank studied the marker. "Tell me about them, Jake. What really happened?" Jake's weather-worn face tightened. "It wasn't all sunshine and roses, if that's what you're asking. Tommy loved her, sure enough. But the life..." He shook his head. "The gang life pulled at him, caused problems between them." "What kind of problems?" "The usual kind. Late nights, dangerous rides, illegal stuff." Jake kicked at a small stone. "She tried to get him to leave the life, almost succeeded too. Then that last ride happened." Hank remembered that night, the screech of tires, the flash of headlights, the sound of metal crushing metal. He'd been there, riding behind Tommy when it happened. Did she blame the gang? Hank asked, though he already suspected the answer. Some, Jake admitted. But mostly, I think she blamed herself for not trying harder to keep him home that night. He paused, looking at Hank with knowing eyes. You were there, weren't you? That night? Hank nodded slowly, his throat tight. Yeah, I was there. Funny how things connect, Jake mused. You were just a kid then, running with us. Now here you are, all these years later, crossing paths with Tommy's widow. The weight of this revelation settled heavy on Hank's shoulders. He'd been there the night Tommy died, had watched helplessly as the accident unfolded. And now, years later, he was face to face with the aftermath. A blind woman abandoned by the community, living alone with her memories. Standing there in the memorial garden, Hank felt the threads of his past weaving together with Ms. Williams's story in ways he never could have imagined. He wasn't just a former student trying to help his teacher. He was a living connection to the night that had changed her life forever. This old community center stood like a tired sentinel, its red brick walls weathered by decades of sun and rain. Hank's heavy boots echoed through the empty hallway as he made his way to the administrative office. The familiar smell of chalk dust and floor polish brought back memories of his school days, when Miss Williams would stand at the front of the classroom, patient and kind, even with troublemakers like him. Can I help you? A woman in her 40s looked up from her desk, her expression guarded as she took in Hank's leather jacket and graying beard. I'm here about Nora Williams, Hank said, trying to soften his gruff voice. She used to teach here. I'm reaching out to former colleagues and students. The woman's face changed, a flicker of recognition followed by something that looked like discomfort. Oh yes, Miss Williams. That was quite a while ago. Hank pressed on. She's going through a rough patch. I thought maybe some of her old friends from the center might want to help. Out! I'll have to check with the board, she said, shuffling papers on her desk. We don't usually get involved in personal matters. Throughout the day, Hank encountered similar responses. In the teacher's lounge, he found Mr. Peterson, now nearly retired himself, who had taught alongside Ms. Williams for 15 years. Of course I remember Nora, Peterson said, stirring his coffee absently. Brilliant teacher. But after what happened with her husband, well, she pushed everyone away. We tried to help at first, but... He shrugged, letting the sentence hang unfinished. In the library, Mrs. Cooper, the longtime librarian, was equally evasive. Such a shame about Nora, she said, reshelving books with careful precision. But we all have our own problems these days. Times are tough for everyone. Hank's frustration grew with each conversation. These people had shared lunches with Ms. Williams, celebrated holidays together, been part of her daily life for years. Now they acted like she was a distant acquaintance, someone else's responsibility. He found similar resistance when he tracked down former students. Some had moved away, others were too busy with their own families. A few remembered her fondly, but quickly made excuses when Hank suggested getting involved. Look, Hank, said Tom Martinez, once the class president and now a successful local businessman. We all liked Miss Williams, but that was 20 years ago. People move on. That's just how life works. Sitting in his truck outside the community center, Hank gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. The betrayal he felt on Ms. Williams' behalf was like a physical weight in his chest. She had given so much to this community, her time, her patience, her wisdom. And now, when she needed them most, they turned their backs. To hell with all of them, he muttered, starting the engine. If the community wouldn't step up, he'd find another way. The idea began to form as he drove. An event, something to remind people who Ms. Williams was and what she meant to this town. Something they couldn't ignore. Pulling into his shop's parking lot, Hank grabbed a notepad from his glove compartment and started writing. He might be just one person, but he had connections from his biker days. People who understood loyalty, who knew what it meant to stand up for your own. He'd make them see, make them remember. Ms. Williams deserved better than to be forgotten by the very people she'd helped shape. Hank's old pickup truck rattled to a stop outside Ms. Williams' modest apartment building. The morning sun cast long shadows across the cracked sidewalk as he climbed out, clutching a folder filled with fundraiser ideas. His weathered boots scuffed against the concrete steps as he made his way to her door. He knocked gently, hearing familiar shuffling footsteps approach from inside. The door opened, and Ms. Williams stood there, her unseeing eyes somehow still managing to convey warmth. "Who is it?" she asked, though her slight smile suggested she already knew. "It's Hank, Ms. Williams. I was hoping we could talk for a few minutes." She stepped aside, gesturing him in. "Of course, come in. Would you like some tea?" "No, thank you," Hank replied, following her into the small living room. He watched as she confidently navigated around her furniture, settling into her favorite armchair. "I actually came to discuss something important with you." Ms. Williams tilted her head, her expression curious. "What's on your mind, Hank?" Hank cleared his throat, suddenly nervous. "I've been thinking about your situation, and I want to organize a fundraiser for you. Nothing fancy, just a community gathering to help with some of your expenses." The smile faded from Ms. Williams' face. "Oh, Hank, no. I couldn't possibly accept that." Her hands twisted in her lap. "I'm managing just fine on my own." "Are you really?" Hank's voice was gentle but firm. "Your roof needs fixing. Your medical bills are piling up, and you're struggling with the bus schedule. There's no shame in accepting help." "I've been a teacher all my life," she protested. "I'm supposed to be the one helping others, not the other way around." Hank leaned forward in his chair. "You helped shape countless lives, including mine. Now it's our turn to give back." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Remember what you always taught us? A community supports its own." Ms. Williams sat quietly for a long moment, her fingers tracing the worn fabric of her armchair. "The community hasn't exactly been supportive lately," she said softly. "Then let's change that," Hank replied. "Give them a chance to make things right." After what seemed like an eternity, Ms. Williams sighed. "You're not going to let this go, are you?" "Not a chance," Hank said, a smile tugging at his lips. "Very well," she conceded, her voice barely above a whisper. "But please, keep it simple." Relief flooded through Hank. He spent the next hour outlining his plans, and by the time he left, Ms. Williams seemed less resistant to the idea. That afternoon, Hank drove around town, posting flyers on community bulletin boards and shop windows. Some business owners welcomed him warmly, while others hesitated before accepting the flyers. At the local diner, Sally, the owner, immediately placed one in her front window. "It's about time someone did something for that sweet woman," she said, adjusting the flyer just so. But at the hardware store, Mr. Peterson, an influential businessman in town, barely glanced at the flyer before handing it back. "I don't think so, Mulligan. We all remember who you used to run with." Hank kept his temper in check, remembering his promise to Ms. Williams to handle things differently now. "This isn't about me, Mr. Peterson. It's about helping someone who dedicated her life to teaching our kids." Despite the mixed reactions, by day's end, most of the town had seen the flyers. Some people even called Hank, offering to help with arrangements. It wasn't the overwhelming support he'd hoped for, but it was a start. The community center buzzed with activity as Hank made final adjustments to the decorations. Streamers in soft blues and whites hung from the ceiling, and folding tables lined the walls, laden with home-baked goods and raffle items. His rough hands smoothed the tablecloth one last time, hoping everything would be perfect. Ms. Williams sat quietly in a corner chair, her fingers nervously playing with the hem of her cardigan. "Hank," she called out softly. "Are there many people here yet?" "They're starting to arrive," Hank replied, his voice gentle. "Don't worry, Ms. Williams. Everything's going to be fine." But even as he said it, his stomach churned with uncertainty. The first wave of townspeople trickled in, some carrying dishes of food, others clutching small envelopes that Hank hoped contained donations. He recognized faces from his past, former classmates, teachers, and neighbors. Some smiled warmly, while others kept their distance, whispering among themselves. Then Tom Crawford walked in. Hank's jaw tightened at the sight of the wealthy businessman. Tom's expensive suit and polished shoes seemed out of place in the modest community center. Their eyes met across the room, and Tom's lips curved into a cold smile. "Well, well," Tom announced loudly, moving through the crowd. "Isn't this touching? Our local reformed bad boy trying to play hero." His voice carried through the room, drawing attention. "But does anyone know the real story here?" Hank stepped forward. "Crawford, this isn't the place." "Oh, I think it is," Tom continued, his voice dripping with false concern. "Everyone should know that Ms. Williams isn't just some poor blind teacher in need. Did you know she's been borrowing money all over town, running up debts she can't pay?" The room grew quiet. Ms. Williams's face paled, and her hands gripped her cane tighter. "That's not true," Hank growled, but Tom wasn't finished. "I have proof right here." Tom pulled out some papers from his jacket. "Outstanding loans, missed payments. She's not just blind, she's practically bankrupt. And now she's got our local ex-con running a charity scam for her." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. People began to shift uncomfortably, some moving toward the exit. Hank watched helplessly as the warmth and goodwill he'd worked so hard to build crumbled around him. "I never—" Ms. Williams's voice quavered. "I never asked for any of this." She stood up shakily, tears rolling down her cheeks. "Hank, please take me home." But before Hank could reach her, she was already making her way to the door, her cane tapping against the floor. The crowd parted silently, watching as she left. Hank stood in the center of the room, surrounded by half-eaten food and abandoned raffle tickets. The streamers that had seemed so festive now hung limply overhead, mocking his efforts. Tom Crawford's satisfied smirk burned in his peripheral vision as people filed out, leaving behind their whispers and judgments. The room emptied quickly, leaving only the echo of footsteps and the soft sound of the door closing behind the last guest. Hank remained rooted to the spot, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. The fundraiser he'd worked so hard to organize lay in ruins around him. And worse, he'd failed the one person who had always believed in him. All that remained was the hollow silence of the community center and the crushing weight of his failure. The morning after the failed fundraiser, Hank sat at his workbench, a half-empty cup of coffee growing cold beside him. The usual sounds of metal tools clinking and engines humming were absent from his shop. He couldn't bring himself to work on any repairs, his mind stuck on the image of Ms. Williams walking away from the community center, her shoulders slumped in defeat. "What a mess," he muttered, running his oil-stained hands through his graying hair. The few customers who came by that morning were met with a "closed for personal reasons" sign hanging crooked on the front door. Through the grimy window, Hank watched people pass by, some of them whispering and pointing at his shop. No doubt Tom Crawford's rumors were still making their rounds through town. The next few days passed in a blur. Hank went through the motions of his daily routine, but his heart wasn't in it. Every time he heard a bus pass by his shop, he thought of Ms. Williams standing alone at that stop. The memory of her confidence, despite her blindness, made his chest tight with regret. On the fourth day, while sorting through his mail, Hank's hands froze on a plain white envelope. The return address was written in careful, slightly crooked handwriting, clearly done with great effort by someone who couldn't see what they were writing. Hank's hands trembled as he opened the letter. Inside was a single page, the words written slowly and deliberately. Dear Hank, I want to thank you for trying to help me. Your kindness reminded me of the good that still exists in people's hearts. But what happened at the fundraiser? It brought back so many painful memories. When John died, I thought I had lost everything. But I was wrong. The real loss came slowly, as friends stopped visiting, as family made excuses not to help. Each person who turned away took a piece of my heart with them. I've spent years telling myself I was strong enough to handle it alone. Maybe I was wrong about that too. Your effort to help meant more than you know, but it also showed me how deeply some wounds can run. This town has changed. Or maybe I never really knew it at all. Thank you for being the one person who tried to make a difference. Sincerely, Nora Williams. Hank read the letter 3 times, each word hitting him harder than the last. He remembered Ms. Williams in his youth, how she'd stand tall at the front of the classroom, how she'd always believed in every student, even the troublemakers like him. She'd never given up on anyone, but everyone had given up on her. The realization made him push back from his workbench with such force that his coffee cup toppled over, spreading a dark stain across the letter's envelope. He didn't bother to clean it up. Instead, he sat there, staring at the wall, seeing not the tools hanging there but the years of isolation Ms. Williams had endured. Her blindness wasn't what had broken her spirit. It was the silence of those who should have cared. The empty promises, the gradual distancing, the polite excuses that masked deeper prejudices. Each small rejection had built up like layers of rust on an old machine, corroding what was once strong and vital. Hank closed his eyes, feeling the weight of his own guilt. He'd been part of that silence too, hadn't he? All those years, he'd never once thought to check on his old teacher, to see if she needed help. He'd been too wrapped up in his own redemption story to notice hers unraveling. There's got to be something more I can do, he whispered to the empty shop. But what? The autumn wind rustled through the trees as Hank stood at Ms. Williams' door, his work-worn hands fidgeting with his jacket zipper. The events of the failed fundraiser weighed heavily on his shoulders. He took a deep breath and knocked. Who is it? Ms. Williams' voice came through the door, softer than usual. It's Hank, Ms. Williams. I wanted to check on you. There was a pause, then the sound of locks being undone. When the door opened, Hank's heart sank. Ms. Williams looked smaller somehow, more fragile than he'd ever seen her. Her usually neat hair was slightly disheveled, and her shoulders drooped with exhaustion. Come in, Hank, she said, stepping aside. I just made some tea. The apartment was dim, with only one lamp casting shadows across the worn furniture. Ms. Williams moved carefully to her familiar spot on the couch, her hands trailing along the wall for guidance. Ms. Williams, I'm so sorry about what happened, Hank began, his voice rough with emotion. I never meant for things to go wrong like that. She smiled sadly, her unseeing eyes directed towards the window. You know what hurts the most, Hank? It's not the failure of the fundraiser. It's being reminded that people can be so cruel. Her hands wrapped tightly around her teacup. But you tried. That means more to me than you know? Hank sat down in the armchair across from her, leaning forward. I'm not giving up. There has to be a better way to help. Hank, she started to protest, but he cut her off gently. No, please listen. You were there for me when I was just a punk kid in your class. You saw something in me when everyone else had written me off. Now it's my turn to help you. Ms. Williams' eyes grew misty. You were never just a punk kid, Hank. You had a good heart, even then. Hank pulled out his phone and opened his notes app. I've been doing some research. There are programs out there, government assistance, community support groups, even special grants for retired teachers. We just need to figure out which ones might work best for you. You've really been looking into all that? Her voice wavered slightly. Yes, ma'am. I've made a whole list. He began reading off options: transportation services for the visually impaired, home assistance programs, social groups for seniors. With each item, Ms. Williams sat up a little straighter, her expression shifting from resignation to cautious hope. I had no idea there were so many resources, she admitted. Me neither, until I started digging. And here's the thing, you don't have to do this alone anymore. I can help you navigate the paperwork, make the calls, whatever you need. Ms. Williams set her teacup down carefully. Hank, why are you doing all this? He was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. Because everyone deserves dignity. Because you spent your life helping others. And because sometimes good people need someone in their corner, fighting for them. A tear rolled down Ms. Williams' cheek. She reached out, and Hank gently took her hand. Thank you, she whispered. Hank squeezed her hand, his determination growing stronger by the minute. The failed fundraiser might have been a setback, but it wasn't the end. He would find a way to make this right, not with flashy events or public displays, but with steady, practical support that would actually make a difference in Ms. Williams's life. The local library was quiet, except for the soft rustling of pages and the occasional tap of computer keys. Hank sat at one of the research computers, his large frame looking somewhat out of place among the neat rows of monitors. His weathered fingers moved slowly across the keyboard as he searched for community support programs that might help Ms. Williams. Hank? Hank Mulligan? A soft voice called from behind him. He turned to see a woman in her late 50s with graying hair and kind eyes. It took him a moment to recognize her. Nancy? Nancy from the elementary school? She nodded, clutching a stack of books to her chest. I haven't seen you around town in years. Her eyes drifted to his computer screen, where information about services for the visually impaired was displayed. Is this about Nora? Hank's expression tightened. Yeah, it is. You probably heard about the fundraiser. Nancy's face fell, and she pulled up a chair next to him. I did. Tom Crawford's always been a spiteful man. She set her books down and wrung her hands in her lap. I should have been there. I should have been there for her years ago. You two were close once, weren't you? Hank asked, turning away from the computer to face her. We taught together for 15 years, Nancy said, her voice thick with emotion. After her husband died, I just didn't know what to say or do. At first, I told myself I was giving her space, but then days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. She dabbed at her eyes with a tissue from her purse. Before I knew it, years had passed, and the gulf between us seemed too wide to cross. Hank nodded, understanding all too well how time could create seemingly insurmountable distances. She needs people now more than ever, he said gently. I know, Nancy whispered. Every time I see her at the bus stop or at the grocery store, my heart breaks a little more. I want to approach her, but I'm ashamed. What kind of friend abandons someone when they need them most? The kind who can still make things right, Hank said firmly. Listen, Nancy, I've learned something about second chances. They're not just given to us. We have to be brave enough to take them. Nancy looked at him with tear-filled eyes. You really think she'd want to see me after all this time? Ms. Williams has the biggest heart of anyone I know, Hank replied. She never gave up on me when I was that troubled kid. In her class. She saw something in me worth believing in, even when I didn't see it myself. She was always like that, Nancy agreed. a small smile forming on her face. She could see the good in everyone, even without her sight. She straightened her shoulders, seeming to come to a decision. "You're right, Hank. I need to see her." They stood up together, and Hank helped Nancy gather her books. "Would you like me to go with you when you visit her?" he offered. "No," Nancy said, shaking her head. "This is something I need to do on my own." "But thank you, Hank. Thank you for reminding me that it's never too late to do the right thing." They walked together toward the library's exit, their footsteps echoing in the quiet space. The afternoon sun streamed through the windows, casting long shadows across the floor. As they reached the doors, Nancy turned to Hank one last time. "You know, you're not that troubled kid anymore, Hank. You've become someone quite remarkable." Hank was tinkering with an old Chevy's engine in his workshop when the bell above the door chimed. Without looking up, he called out, "Be right with you." His hands were covered in grease, and he needed to finish tightening one last bolt. The sound of expensive leather shoes clicking against the concrete floor made him pause. Those weren't the usual work boots his customers wore. He turned around and froze. Tom Crawford stood there in his tailored suit, looking as out of place in the garage as a penguin in a desert. "Mulligan," Tom said, clearing his throat. His usual confidence seemed dampened, and he kept adjusting his silk tie. Hank grabbed a rag and wiped his hands. "Crawford, come to cause more trouble?" His voice was gruff, but he kept his anger in check. "Actually," Tom said, taking a deep breath, "I came to apologize." He glanced around the workshop, his eyes landing on an old motorcycle in the corner. "Mind if we talk?" Hank gestured to a couple of chairs near his workbench. They sat, down, the silence between them thick with years of rivalry and recent hurt. "What you did at the fundraiser," Hank started, but Tom held up his hand. "Was wrong. I know." Tom's shoulders slumped. "I've been thinking about it a lot, about why I did it." He pulled out a handkerchief and dabbed at his forehead. "You want to know the truth? I was jealous." Hank's eyebrows shot up. "Jealous? Of what?" "You were always free," Tom said, the words coming out like they pained him. "Back in school, everyone liked you, even when you were causing trouble. Ms. Williams especially saw something in you." "Me?" He shook his head. "I was just the rich kid trying too hard to fit in." Hank sat back, studying the man before him. He'd never seen Tom Crawford look so human. "When I heard about the fundraiser," Tom continued, "all those old feelings came rushing back. Here you were, the reformed bad boy, playing hero again." He met Hank's eyes. "But what I did to Ms. Williams was unforgivable. She never did anything to deserve that." Tom reached into his jacket and pulled out a checkbook. "I want to make it right," he started writing. "This should cover her medical expenses for the next year, plus some extra for home modifications she might need." Hank stared at the check Tom was holding out, his mind struggling to process this turn of events. "Why now?" "Because I realized something," Tom said, his voice softer than Hank had ever heard it. "While I was busy holding on to old grudges, you were actually trying to help someone in need. That's worth more than all my business success." Hank took the check, his hands slightly shaking. The amount written on it was more than he'd hoped to raise at the fundraiser. "I can't guarantee Ms. Williams will accept this," Hank said honestly. "I know," Tom nodded, "but I hope she will. And Mulligan?" He stood up, straightening his jacket. "I really am sorry." The late afternoon sun cast long shadows through Ms. Williams's living room window as Hank and Nancy stood on her doorstep. Hank's rough knuckles rapped gently against the wooden frame. "Ms. Williams, it's Hank. Nancy's here with me too." They heard shuffling inside, and moments later, The door opened. Ms. Williams stood there, her unseeing eyes bright with curiosity. "Nancy? Is it really you?" "Yes, Nora. It's me." Nancy's voice quivered with emotion. "I'm so sorry I've stayed away for so long." Ms. Williams reached out, her hands finding Nancy's shoulders, then pulled her into a tight embrace. Tears streamed down both women's faces as years of distance melted away. Inside, they settled in Ms. Williams' modest living room. Hank cleared his throat. "Ms. Williams, there's something we need to tell you. The community, they want to help. And Tom Crawford, he's offered financial support." Ms. Williams' hands trembled as she clutched her teacup. "Tom Crawford? The same man who—" "Yes," Hank interrupted gently. "He came to see me personally. He realizes he was wrong and wants to make things right." Nancy reached over and squeezed Ms. Williams' hand. "We're planning another fundraiser, Nora, a proper one this time. We've already got several local businesses on board." "I don't understand," Ms. Williams whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "After all this time, why now?" "Because we should have been there all along," Nancy admitted. "I should have been there. When John died, I didn't know how to handle it. It was easier to stay away than face the pain." Hank watched as the two women reconnected, discussing plans for the fundraiser. They talked about setting up a trust for medical expenses and home care, ensuring Ms. Williams would never have to worry about being alone again. "The senior center has already offered to provide transportation services," Nancy explained, her enthusiasm growing. "And the library wants to start a reading program where volunteers come to your home." Ms. Williams sat quietly, overwhelmed by the sudden outpouring of support. Her hands fidgeted with the worn fabric of her armchair, and Hank noticed tears forming in her eyes again. After Nancy left to make some phone calls, Hank stayed behind. The room grew quiet, filled only with the soft ticking of an old clock on the wall. "Hank?" Ms. Williams's voice was barely above a whisper. "Would you mind sitting with me for a moment?" He moved closer, taking the chair beside her. "Of course." "You know, after John died," she began, her voice breaking slightly, "it wasn't just the loss of him that hurt. It was watching everyone slowly drift away. People I'd taught, colleagues I'd worked with for years, friends I thought would always be there." She paused, collecting herself. The silence became deafening. Hank listened intently as she continued. "The hardest part wasn't losing my sight, or even losing John. It was the feeling that I'd somehow become invisible to everyone else too. Every day, I'd wake up hoping someone would call or visit, but the phone stayed silent. The doorbell never rang. Her hands twisted in her lap. I kept telling myself I was strong enough to handle it alone, that I didn't need anyone. But the truth is, Hank, being abandoned by people you love, it changes you, makes you afraid to trust again." The community center buzzed with activity as people streamed through the doors. Colorful banners hung from the walls, and tables lined with homemade baked goods and crafts filled the space. Hank stood near the entrance, greeting each arrival with a firm handshake and a grateful smile. His weathered face bore none of the hardness it once had. Instead, his eyes sparkled with hope. Nancy worked the registration table, collecting donations and sharing stories about Ms. Williams's impact on the community. "She taught my daughter to read," one elderly woman said, dabbing at her eyes. "Even after she lost her sight, she never lost her patience." The atmosphere was worlds apart from the failed first fundraiser, where there had been empty chairs and whispered rumors. Now there was standing room only. Local business owners who had once turned their backs came forward with generous contributions. Former students, now grown with children of their own, shared memories of Ms. Williams' kindness and dedication. "Remember how she used to bring extra sandwiches for kids who couldn't afford lunch?" one man asked another. "She never made a fuss about it, just quietly made sure everyone was taken care of. Hank watched as Tom Crawford, the businessman who had once sabotaged their efforts, worked alongside others to set up additional chairs. The man's earlier apology had sparked a chain reaction of goodwill throughout the town. People who had stayed away out of guilt or indifference were now stepping forward to help. Ms. Williams sat in a comfortable chair near the center of the room, her hands folded in her lap. Though she couldn't see the crowd, she could feel their presence, in their voices, their footsteps, and the gentle touches on her shoulder as people stopped to greet her. Nancy stayed close by, describing the scene in quiet whispers. "The Mitchell twins just arrived," Nancy said, leaning close to Miss Williams' ear. "They're all grown up now, but they're wearing matching outfits, just like when they were in your class." A small smile played across Ms. Williams' face. "Some things never change," she murmured. The donation total kept climbing. Some gave money, while others offered services: home-cooked meals, rides to appointments, help with household repairs. A local doctor pledged to provide free checkups, and a taxi service offered unlimited transportation. "I never expected this," Ms. Williams whispered to Hank when he came to check on her. Her voice quivered with emotion. "All these years I thought everyone had forgotten." "They never forgot," Hank replied, his gruff voice gentle. "Sometimes people just need a reminder of what matters." The afternoon wore on, and the steady stream of visitors continued. Each person who approached Ms. Williams had a story to share, a moment when she had made a difference, a kind word that had changed their direction, a lesson that had stuck with them through the years. As Nancy announced the final donation total, more than triple their goal, Ms. Williams's composure finally broke. Tears rolled down her cheeks as she listened to the cheers and applause. Her hands trembled as she reached out, and both Hank and Nancy took them in theirs. "I've been so alone," she said softly, her voice thick with emotion. "For so long, I thought I had to be strong by myself." The crowd grew quiet, drawing closer to hear her words. Someone started singing an old school song, one Ms. Williams used to teach her students. Other voices joined in, filling the community center with melody. Ms. Williams sat straighter in her chair, tears still flowing. But now she was smiling, really smiling, for the first time in years. The community center buzzed with excited chatter as the last of the donors made their contributions. Colorful streamers and balloons still hung from the ceiling, though some had started to droop. Hank stood by the donation box, his weathered hands carefully counting the day's proceeds. His eyes widened as he tallied the final amount. It was more than double what they'd hoped for. Ms. Williams sat nearby, her hands folded neatly in her lap, a peaceful smile on her face. The soft murmur of departing townspeople filled the air as Nancy helped clean up the refreshment table. "Ms. Williams," Hank said, his voice rough with emotion. "We did it. We really did it." She turned her face toward his voice. "Tell me, Hank. Tell me everything." "Well," he began, pulling up a chair beside her. "We've got enough here to cover your medical expenses for the next year, plus some home modifications to make things easier for you. And Tom Crawford's matching donation will set up a trust fund for your long-term care." Ms. Williams reached out and found Hank's hand, squeezing it gently. "It's not just about the money, though, is it?" "No, ma'am, it's not," Hank replied, looking around at the now empty community center. "It's about people coming together, about remembering what matters." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment before Ms. Williams spoke again. "You know, Hank, I've been thinking about the future." "Oh?" Hank leaned forward, curious. "Yes. This whole experience has shown me something important. There must be others out there, just like me, people who feel forgotten or left behind." Hank nodded, then remembered she couldn't see him. "There are, Ms. Williams. Too many." "Then perhaps," she said, straightening in her chair, This is just the beginning. Maybe we could create something more permanent, a program to help others who are struggling with isolation or disability." "I'd like that," Hank said, his voice growing stronger with enthusiasm. "We could use part of the community center, maybe set up regular meetings, organize support groups." "And you could lead it, Hank," Ms. Williams suggested. "You've shown quite a talent for bringing people together." Hank felt his chest tighten with emotion. "Only because of what you taught me, Ms. Williams, both then and now." Later that evening, Hank walked Ms. Williams home to her apartment. The spring air was cool and fresh, carrying the scent of blooming flowers. As they reached her door, she turned to face him. "Thank you, Hank," she said softly, "not just for today, but for seeing me when others looked away." "I should be thanking you," he replied, helping her with her keys. "You helped me find something I've been missing for a long time, a real purpose." Inside her apartment, they spent a few minutes discussing their plans for the future program. Ms. Williams's excitement was contagious as she shared her ideas for reaching out to others in need. As Hank prepared to leave, he paused in the doorway. Looking back at his former teacher, he saw not the vulnerable woman he'd encountered at the bus stop, but a strong, determined individual ready to make a difference in others' lives. "Same time tomorrow?" he asked. "We can start working on the program details." "I'll be here," she replied with a warm smile. "Good night, Hank." Walking down the hallway, Hank felt lighter than he had in years. His past as a Hell's Angel seemed distant now, replaced by something far more meaningful. Each step carried him forward with a new sense of purpose, one that had been there all along, waiting to be discovered. The late afternoon sun filtered through the windows of Hank's mechanic shop as he wiped his hands clean after finishing up his last repair of the day. His eyes wandered to an old photograph on the wall, a younger version of himself straddling a motorcycle, leather jacket adorned with patches, a scowl on his face. Next to it hung a new picture, him and Ms. Williams at the successful fundraiser, both beaming with joy. "Who would have thought?" he muttered to himself, shaking his head with a smile. The transformation from an angry young biker to a pillar of community support still amazed him. Later that evening, Hank sat across from Ms. Williams in her cozy living room, now brightened by fresh flowers and cards from well-wishers. The success of the fundraiser had sparked an idea in both of them. "We could help so many people," Ms. Williams said, her fingers tracing the edge of her teacup. "There are others out there, Hank, just like me. People who feel forgotten." Hank leaned forward in his chair. "I've been thinking about that too, with the connections we've made and Tom Crawford's business expertise." He paused, still amazed at how his former adversary had become an ally. "We could start something permanent." They spent hours discussing the details. Hank's mechanical skills could provide practical help for those in need. Ms. Williams' teaching experience could be used to train volunteers. The foundation would focus on helping elderly and disabled members of the community who had fallen through the cracks. "The Helping Hands Foundation," Ms. Williams suggested, her face lighting up. "Because everyone needs a helping hand sometimes." Over the next few weeks, they put their plan into action. Hank converted part of his shop into a community space. Nancy helped with the paperwork, while Tom Crawford provided financial guidance. Word spread quickly through the small town. Their first success story was Mr. Peterson, an elderly veteran whose roof had been leaking for months. Hank organized a team of volunteers, including some of his old biker friends, to fix it. The sight of former Hell's Angels carefully replacing shingles alongside high school students made the local newspaper. More projects followed. Ms. Williams started a program matching isolated seniors with young volunteers for weekly visits. Hank's shop became a hub for people seeking help or offering their services. "You've changed this town," Ms. Williams told him one afternoon as they prepared for their foundation's first community gathering. The local community center buzzed with activity as volunteers set up chairs and hung banners. "We've changed it," Hank corrected her, guiding her arm as they walked through the room. "I just followed your example. You never gave up on me when I was young, even when everyone else did." "And look at you now," she said proudly, patting his arm. "From Hell's Angel to Guardian Angel." The room filled with people, familiar faces from their successful fundraiser, new volunteers eager to help, and community members curious about their mission. Hank watched as Ms. Williams moved confidently through the crowd, her cane tapping gently against the floor, stopping to chat and welcome everyone personally. Standing at the edge of the room, Hank felt a warmth spread through his chest. The tough exterior he'd worn like armor for so many years had given way to something stronger, a genuine desire to help others. His past, once a source of shame, had become a testament to the possibility of change. Ms. Williams made her way back to him, smiling. "Ready to make our announcement?" she asked, reaching for his arm. The morning sun cast long shadows through the windows of Hank's auto shop as he sorted through his mail. Among the usual bills and advertisements, a wrinkled envelope caught his eye. The return address made his heart skip a beat. It was from Jake, his old riding buddy from his biker days. Hank wiped his greasy hands on a shop rag and carefully opened the letter. Jake's messy handwriting filled the page, bringing back memories of wild nights and dangerous rides. But what caught Hank's attention was the last paragraph. Jake was passing through town and wanted to meet up. 3 days later, the familiar rumble of a Harley-Davidson echoed through the shop's open garage door. Hank looked up from the engine he was working on to see Jake rolling in, his leather jacket weathered but still bearing their old gang's insignia. "Well, if it ain't the reformed rebel himself," Jake called out, killing the engine. His salt-and-pepper beard couldn't hide his wide grin. Hank straightened up, a genuine smile spreading across his face. "Jake, you old troublemaker, you're looking rough around the edges." The two men embraced in a bear hug, slapping each other's backs. Jake pulled away and looked around the shop, taking in the neat rows of tools and the steady stream of customers' cars. "Never thought I'd see the day. Hank Mulligan running a legitimate business," Jake chuckled, shaking his head. "What happened to the guy who swore he'd never settle down?" Hank gestured to a couple of folding chairs in the corner of the shop. "Life has a way of changing your perspective," he said, grabbing 2 sodas from a small fridge. "How long you been clean?" Jake accepted the drink with a nod. "Going on 2 years now. Following your example, old friend. But word is you're doing more than just fixing cars these days." Hank took a long sip of his soda, considering how to explain his transformation. He told Jake about Ms. Williams, about finding her at the bus stop, and everything that followed. As he spoke, Jake's expression shifted from curiosity to genuine concern. "Ms. Williams? The teacher who used to let us park our bikes behind the school so they wouldn't get vandalized?" Jake's voice softened with recognition. "She always treated us with respect, even when nobody else would." "That's her," Hank confirmed. "She needed help, Jake. The whole town had turned their backs on her. I couldn't just walk away." Jake stood up and paced the shop floor, running a hand through his graying hair. "Man, that hits hard. We were so caught up in our own drama back then, we never thought about how others might need us." "It's never too late to make things right," Hank said, watching his old friend process the information. Jake stopped pacing and turned to face Hank. "You know what? I want to help. The foundation you mentioned, maybe some of us old riders could contribute. We've got skills, connections. Hell, we could organize charity rides, raise some real money." Hank studied Jake's face, seeing the same determination he'd felt when he first decided to help Ms. Williams. "You serious about this?" "Dead serious," Jake replied, his voice firm. "It's time we gave back to someone who never gave up on us, even when we were at our worst." The morning sun cast long shadows through the window of Hank's office at the foundation. He sat at his desk, staring at the stack of bills and financial reports that seemed to mock him. The numbers weren't adding up the way they should, and the foundation's bank account was running dangerously low. "This can't be happening," Hank muttered, running his calloused hands through his graying hair. The past few months had been so promising, with new programs, helping dozens of elderly and disabled residents. But the costs had mounted faster than the donations came in. Nancy burst through the door, her face flushed with concern. "Hank, I just heard from the hospital. They're doubling their fees for the medical transport program." Hank's stomach dropped. The medical transport program was vital. It helped people like Ms. Williams get to their doctor appointments. Without it, many would be stranded. The community rallied when they heard about the foundation's struggles. Tom Crawford organized an emergency fundraising dinner. Jake reached out to his old biker contacts, who showed up in leather jackets with checkbooks in hand. Even the local grocery store started a donation drive at their registers. But then came the blow nobody expected. The grant they'd been counting on, their biggest source of funding for the next year, fell through. The email arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, its formal language crushing their hopes with each carefully worded sentence. Hank sat in his truck outside the foundation building, feeling the weight of failure pressing down on him. He thought about all the people counting on them, all the promises they'd made. His hands gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. "Maybe I was fooling myself," he whispered to the empty cab, "thinking a guy like me could really change things." The tap on his window startled him. Ms. Williams stood there, her white cane in one hand, Nancy at her elbow. Despite her blindness, she somehow knew exactly where to face to meet his gaze. "Going to sit in there all day?" she asked, a hint of her teacher's authority in her voice. Inside the office, Ms. Williams settled into the chair across from his desk. "Nancy tells me you're having doubts," she said directly. "The foundation's in trouble," Hank admitted. "We might have to cut some programs. I thought we could do more." Ms. Williams leaned forward, her unseeing eyes somehow still full of wisdom. "Do you remember what my classroom was like, Hank? The day you first walked in? Of course. You had all those inspirational posters on the walls. And do you remember what my favorite saying was?" Hank thought for a moment. "Progress isn't measured in miles, but in steps." "Exactly." Ms. Williams smiled. "Last week, Sarah from the senior center told me she doesn't feel alone anymore, thanks to our visiting program. Tommy Jenkins finally got his wheelchair fixed because of our repair service, and Mrs. Rodriguez can see her doctor regularly now." She reached across the desk, and Hank took her hand. "These aren't small things, Hank. These are life-changing things. So we hit a rough patch. That doesn't erase all the good we've done." Hank squeezed her hand, feeling the tightness in his chest begin to loosen. He looked around the office, at the thank you cards pinned to the bulletin board, at the photos of smiling faces from their community events. "You're right," he said, softly. "We've come too far to give up now." Hank sat at his desk in the small foundation office, surrounded by stacks of paperwork and grant applications. The afternoon sun filtered through the dusty blinds, casting long shadows across the worn carpet. His coffee had gone cold hours ago, but he barely noticed, too focused on the numbers that weren't adding up. "There has to be a way," he muttered, running his calloused hands through his graying hair. The foundation needed another $50,000 to keep their programs running through the next year. Without it, they'd have to cut back on their services to the elderly and disabled in the community. His phone buzzed, and he saw Ms. Williams' name on the screen. Despite everything, she never lost faith in him or their mission. Her unwavering belief in him had kept him going through countless setbacks. He picked up the phone. "Hank," her warm voice came through. "I just wanted to check on you. You've been working so hard lately." "I'm still at it," he replied, his voice softening. "These numbers, they're giving me a headache, but I'm not giving up." "That's the Hank I know," she said. "By the way, did you get the message about Mr. Henderson wanting to meet with you?" Hank straightened in his chair. Robert Henderson was a successful businessman who'd recently moved to town. "No, I didn't." "When?" "He called this morning. He'd like to meet with you tomorrow at his office downtown." After hanging up, Hank spent the evening preparing a presentation about the Foundation's work. He pulled together success stories, photographs, and financial reports, determined to make the most of this opportunity. The next morning, Hank traded his usual leather jacket for a borrowed suit that felt too tight around the shoulders. As he walked into the gleaming office building, he felt out of place among the polished marble and glass. But when he thought of Ms. Williams and all the people they helped, he stood taller. Mr. Henderson's office was on the top floor. The businessman, dressed in an expensive suit, greeted Hank with a firm handshake. "Mr. Mulligan, I've heard a lot about your work." "Just Hank is fine," he replied, settling into the offered chair. "I've been watching your foundation's progress since I moved here," Henderson said, leaning back in his chair. "It's impressive what you've accomplished with limited resources." Hank began his presentation, speaking from the heart about their mission. He showed photos of their community events, shared stories of lives changed, and explained their financial situation with honest directness. When he finished, Henderson was silent for a moment. Then he smiled. "You know, Hank, I grew up poor. My grandmother raised me, and there were times when we needed help but had nowhere to turn. What you're doing, it matters." Henderson reached for his checkbook. "I'd like to make a contribution to your foundation. Would $75,000 help secure your programs for the next year?" Hank stared at him, momentarily speechless. That would more than cover what we need." "Consider it done," Henderson said, writing out the check. "Sometimes all it takes is one person willing to make a difference. You've proven that with your own transformation, Hank." As Hank left the office building, check in hand, he felt a weight lift from his shoulders. The foundation would continue its work, touching more lives and bringing hope to those who needed it most. He couldn't wait to share the news with Ms. Williams. Ms. Williams sat in her favorite armchair, her fingers trembling as they traced over the Braille letter in her hands. The morning sun streamed through her window, warming her face, but she felt a chill run through her body as she absorbed the words from her sister Margaret. "I don't know what to make of this, Hank," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Hank, who had come over for their usual morning coffee, sat across from her, watching her face carefully. The letter was full of regret and apologies. Margaret wrote about how ashamed she was for pulling away after Ms. Williams' husband died, how she'd let fear and uncertainty guide her actions. Her brother David had signed the letter too, expressing similar sentiments. "They want to meet for lunch next Sunday," Ms. Williams said, her hands dropping to her lap. "After all these years of silence." Hank leaned forward in his chair. "How do you feel about that?" Ms. Williams took a deep breath, her fingers fidgeting with the corner of the letter. "Honestly, I'm terrified. When John died, they just disappeared. No calls, no visits. It was like losing my whole family at once." "You don't have to meet them if you're not ready," Hank said gently. Ms. Williams stood up and walked to her window, her hand finding the familiar windowsill with practiced ease. "But what if this is my only chance? What if—" She paused, swallowing hard. "What if I never get another opportunity to make things right?" The room fell silent except for the ticking of the old clock on the wall. Ms. Williams could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on her shoulders. Her family had hurt her deeply, but the thought of possibly reconnecting made her heart ache with longing. "I'll go with you," Hank offered, "if you want some support." Ms. Williams turned toward his voice, a small smile finding its way to her lips. "You've already done so much, Hank." "That's what friends are for," he replied simply. After another long moment, Ms. Williams straightened her shoulders. I think I need to do this, even if it's just to find some closure." She made her way back to her chair and reached for her phone. With slightly shaking fingers, she dialed the number Margaret had included in the letter. Each ring seemed to last an eternity. "Margaret?" she said when her sister answered. "It's Nora." Her sister's voice cracked with emotion on the other end. "Nora, I'm so glad you called. About lunch on Sunday." Ms. Williams paused, gathering her courage. "I'd like to come." They arranged to meet at the small Italian restaurant downtown, the one where they used to celebrate family birthdays years ago. When Ms. Williams hung up the phone, she felt both lighter and heavier at the same time. That Sunday, Ms. Williams stood outside the restaurant, her hand resting on Hank's arm for guidance. The familiar sense of garlic and fresh bread wafted through the air, bringing back a flood of memories. "They're here," Hank said softly. Ms. Williams heard footsteps approaching, then a gasp that could only be her sister's. "Nora!" Margaret's voice wavered. Without warning, she felt arms wrapping around her. First Margaret's, then David's. Tears began flowing freely down her cheeks as she held on to her siblings, years of hurt and love and longing pouring out all at once. "We're so sorry," David whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Ms. Williams nodded, unable to speak for a moment. It wasn't perfect. There were still years of pain to work through, conversations that needed to be had, trust that needed to be rebuilt. But as they stood there embracing, she felt something she hadn't felt in years: hope for her family's future. The morning sun filtered through the windows of Ms. Williams' living room, casting warm patches of light across the floor. Hank sat in his usual spot on the weathered armchair while Ms. Williams settled into her favorite rocking chair, a soft smile playing on her face. "Can you believe how different things are now?" Ms. Williams asked, her hands folded neatly in her lap. "I can feel it in the air, in the way people speak to me when I'm out." Hank looked around the room, noticing the fresh flowers on the windowsill, a weekly gift from the garden club that had formed to support seniors in the community. "It's like a completely different town," he agreed, his voice gruff with emotion. "Just yesterday, Sarah from the grocery store insisted on having someone help me with my shopping," Ms. Williams continued. "Not because she thought I couldn't manage, but because she wanted me to have company." She chuckled softly. "That would never have happened 6 months ago." Hank nodded, then remembered she couldn't see him. "Yes, ma'am. The foundation's really changed things around here. People are looking out for each other more." Ms. Williams leaned forward slightly. "And you're a big part of that change, Hank. You showed them what was possible when someone cares enough to take action." The praise made Hank uncomfortable, but in a good way. He shifted in his seat, remembering his wild days as a young biker. "Sometimes I think about who I used to be," he admitted, "all that time wasted being angry at the world. But now you're making a real difference," Ms. Williams finished for him. "The foundation has helped so many people. Did you hear about the Peterson family? Their daughter needed special equipment for school, and the community raised the money in just 2 days." Hank smiled, remembering the look of joy on little Amy Peterson's face when they delivered her new learning tools. "People just needed a reminder that we're all in this together," he said. A knock at the door interrupted their conversation. Nancy, who had become a regular visitor, poked her head in. "Sorry to interrupt," she said, "but I've got the mail from the Foundation's P.O. box." She handed Hank a stack of envelopes. As he sorted through them, a pale blue envelope caught his eye. The handwriting was careful and neat. He opened it, and as he read, his throat tightened with emotion. "What is it?" Ms. Williams asked, sensing the change in his breathing. "It's from the Martinez family," Hank said, his voice rough. "Remember how we helped them fix their heating last winter?" Ms. Williams nodded. "Of course. Their little boy has asthma. They needed it badly." Hank cleared his throat and read aloud. "Dear Mr. Mulligan and Ms. Williams, we wanted to thank you again for what you did for our family. This winter, for the first time in years, Miguel didn't have a single asthma attack. The doctor says it's because he's finally sleeping in a warm room. You didn't just fix our heating, you changed our lives. We'll never forget your kindness." Ms. Williams wiped a tear from her cheek. "That's what it's all about, isn't it? Small changes that make big differences." "Yeah," Hank agreed softly. "That's exactly what it's about." He looked at the letter in his hands, thinking about how far they'd come from that day at the bus stop. The Foundation wasn't just helping people with their immediate needs. It was rebuilding the very fabric of their community, one act of kindness at a time. Hank pulled his truck into the familiar spot across from the old bus stop. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the cracked concrete, and a gentle breeze rustled through the newly planted maple trees lining the street. He sat there for a moment, hands resting on the steering wheel, taking in how different everything looked now. The bus stop had been renovated. A proper shelter stood where the old, rusty sign used to be, complete with comfortable benches and clear schedule postings. But more than the physical changes, it was the atmosphere that felt different. Where there had once been coldness and isolation, there was now warmth and community. Hank climbed out of his truck, his boots scuffing against the pavement as he made his way to the shelter. He ran his hand along the smooth metal frame, remembering that day months ago when he'd spotted Miss Williams standing alone, forgotten by the world. The memory still pulled at his heart, but now it carried a different weight. "I thought I might find you here," a familiar voice called out. Ms. Williams approached steadily, her white cane tapping rhythmically against the sidewalk. Nancy, her friend who had reconnected with her, walked beside her. "Just dropping off some flyers for next week's Foundation meeting," Hank said, though they both knew that wasn't the real reason he was there. Nancy helped Ms. Williams to the bench, then excused herself with a gentle squeeze of Ms. Williams's shoulder. "I'll see you both at the meeting," she said, leaving them to their moment. "It's peaceful here now," Ms. Williams said, patting the spot next to her. Hank sat down, the metal bench cool beneath him. "Sure is different from that first day," he agreed, his voice gruff with emotion. "Remember how that bus driver just drove right past?" Ms. Williams smiled, but it wasn't a sad smile anymore. "Things change, Hank. People change. You taught me that." Hank shook his head, even though she couldn't see it. "No, ma'am. You taught me that. Long before all this. Back when I was just a troublemaking kid in your classroom." "And look at you now," she said proudly. "Running a foundation, helping others who feel forgotten. Your mother would have been so proud." The mention of his mother made Hank's throat tight. "Sometimes I wonder what she'd think, seeing me now, seeing how things turned out. She'd see what I've always seen, a good heart that just needed time to find its way." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the sounds of the town around them. Children's laughter drifted from the nearby park, another new addition to the neighborhood, funded in part by their foundation. "You know," Ms. Williams said thoughtfully, When my sight first started failing, I thought the world was ending. Then when Thomas died, I was sure of it. But sitting here now..." She reached out and found Hank's hand, giving it a gentle squeeze. I realized that sometimes what feels like an ending is really just a beginning in disguise. Hank looked at their joined hands, thinking about all the twists and turns that had led them here. The failed first fundraiser, the community's transformation, the healing of old wounds. It all seemed impossible just months ago. "Never thought I'd find peace in this town again," he admitted. "Always felt like I was running from something. Now you're running toward something," Ms. Williams finished for him. "We both are." The late afternoon sun warmed their faces as they sat together. Two souls who had found their purpose in helping others find their way home. The community center buzzed with activity as people streamed through its doors. Colorful banners hung from the walls, and the smell of fresh coffee and homemade cookies filled the air. Hank stood near the entrance, greeting guests with a warm smile, a far cry from his once intimidating demeanor. His weathered leather jacket had been traded for a neat button-down shirt, though he couldn't quite bring himself to give up his worn boots. "Hank," Ms. Williams called from across the room, her voice carrying the same warmth it had when she'd been his teacher years ago. "Could you help me with the podium?" Made his way through the crowd, gently touching her elbow to let her know he was there. "Right here, Ms. Williams, though I still think you should let me do most of the talking." She laughed, the sound carrying across the room. "Not a chance, Mr. Mulligan. I may be blind, but I haven't lost my gift for public speaking." The room was filled with familiar faces. Nancy stood chatting with Tom Crawford, who had become one of their strongest supporters. Jake and several other reformed bikers had shown up, looking slightly uncomfortable in their clean shirts, but proud to be there. Even Ms. Williams's family members, who had recently reconnected with her, sat in the front row. "Look at all these people," Hank marveled, describing the scene to Ms. Williams. "Who would have thought a gruff old biker and his former teacher could bring so many folks together?" Ms. Williams reached out and squeezed his arm. "You've always had it in you, Hank. Sometimes it just takes the right moment to bring out the best in people." The celebration began with a simple ceremony. One by one, people stood to share stories about how the foundation had touched their lives. An elderly man spoke about how they'd helped him repair his home after a storm. A young mother tearfully described how they'd provided support when she lost her job. Each story added another thread to the tapestry of community they'd woven together. When it was Ms. Williams's turn to speak, she stood confidently at the podium. "A year ago, I stood alone at a bus stop, feeling like the world had forgotten me. But that day, an old student, a man I'd once tried to keep out of trouble, showed me that kindness can come from the most unexpected places." She paused, her voice thick with emotion. "This foundation isn't just about helping people with their immediate needs. It's about reminding everyone that they matter, that they're not alone." Hank watched the crowd, seeing heads nod and tears being wiped away. The tough businessman Tom Crawford was actually sniffling, trying to hide it behind his handkerchief. Jake and his biker friend stood straighter, pride evident in their bearing. After the speeches, as people mingled and shared refreshments, Hank and Ms. Williams found a quiet corner. The sounds of laughter and conversation created a warm backdrop to their moment of reflection. "You know," Ms. Williams said softly, "when you first stopped to help me that day, I thought it was just a kind gesture from a stranger. I never imagined it would lead to all this." Hank looked around at the room full of people whose lives they'd touched. "Neither did I. I was just trying to make up for past mistakes. But you showed me it was never about making up for anything. It was about moving forward and doing what's right." Ms. Williams smiled, her unseeing eyes bright with joy. "We did more than move forward, Hank. We helped an entire community remember what it means to care for each other. The autumn breeze rustled through the leaves as Hank stood on the steps of the Foundation's building, now a bustling center of community activity. The sign above the door read, "Williams Mulligan Foundation, a home for everyone." He smiled, remembering the long journey that had brought them here. Inside, volunteers moved purposefully through the halls, helping elderly residents with their daily activities. The once empty building now buzzed with life and warmth. Photos lined the walls, snapshots of countless lives touched by their work. Hank paused at each one, recognizing the faces of people they'd helped over the years. "I never thought I'd see the day," Ms. Williams said softly, her cane tapping gently as she approached. Despite her blindness, she navigated the familiar space with confidence. "All those years ago, when you found me at that bus stop, who would have guessed?" Hank chuckled, the sound warm and genuine. "Not me, that's for sure. I was just a broken-down biker trying to make amends." "You were more than that," Ms. Williams corrected him, reaching out to pat his arm. "You were the catalyst this community needed." They walked together through the building's common area, where elderly residents gathered for their morning activities. Some played cards, others worked on crafts, but all of them had one thing in common. They were no longer alone. "Remember when we first started?" Hank asked, helping Ms. Williams into her favorite chair by the window. "People thought we were crazy." They did indeed. She smiled, her face illuminated by the morning sun. "But sometimes the craziest ideas are the ones that work best." Through the window, they could hear the sounds of children playing in the Foundation's garden. The intergenerational program had been Ms. Williams' idea, bringing together lonely seniors with local youth for mentoring and companionship. "You know," Hank said, settling into the chair beside her, "I used to think redemption meant making up for past mistakes. But it's more than that, isn't it?" Ms. Williams nodded thoughtfully. "It's about creating something new, something good. It's about taking what you've learned and using it to help others." The Foundation had grown beyond their wildest dreams. What started as a simple fundraiser had blossomed into a full-service community center, offering support to anyone who needed it. They had programs for the elderly, the disabled, at-risk youth, and families in crisis. "We've built something real here," Hank said, his voice thick with emotion. "Something that'll last." "Yes, we have," Ms. Williams agreed, reaching for his hand. "And it's changed more than just the people we help. Look at how the community has come together." She was right. The town that had once been divided was now united in purpose. People who had previously turned their backs on others now volunteered regularly. Even Tom Crawford, who had once tried to sabotage their efforts, had become one of their strongest supporters. "You know what makes me proudest?" Hank asked, watching a group of teenagers helping an elderly man with his garden plot. "What's that?" "That we proved change is possible, that it's never too late to start over, to do better." Ms. Williams squeezed his hand. "That's always been true, Hank. Sometimes people just need someone to remind them." The morning light streamed through the windows, warming them both as they sat together. Two unlikely friends who had found their purpose in helping others. The Foundation was more than just a building or a service. It was a testament to the power of second chances and the strength of human connection. I hope you like this story. Please share what's your favorite part of the story and where in the world you are watching from. Have a wonderful day.